Hi, y'all. Welcome back to Gen X Life Lab. Have you ever taken a personality test, or maybe a strengths assessment, or a career quiz? And maybe when you got your results, you were really excited to see what it had to say. But then you started looking at the answers on the page and you're like, that doesn't really sound like me. And you were kind of disappointed. Maybe it told you should be a scientist, or a counselor, or a funeral director. And maybe some part of it felt true, but the biggest part of it didn't. I think one of the largest problems with personality tests isn't that they're wrong. I think there is a lot of truth to be found in them, honestly. But I think the biggest problem is that we secretly hope that they're going to give us the answer, the career, the identity, the purpose, the one thing we're supposed to become. And then when they don't, we assume something is wrong with us. But what if the problem isn't with the test? What if the problem is that human beings aren't static? What if you're not a label to discover, but a life that is still unfolding? So why do we love these assessments so much? I think, especially when we're younger and trying to find our way, it can be exciting to think that I can take this test and it's going to give me the answers that I seek. I remember the first time I was exposed to any type of exam like this was probably 30 years ago when I was first given the Myers-Briggs test. And I was so fascinated by the results. And I didn't see anything other than, here are your 4 letters. And at that time, I was an ISTJ, which is introverted, sensor, thinker, judger. So then time went on, because that really didn't illuminate a whole lot for me. And I've been given DISC exams, I've taken StrengthsFinder, I've done Enneagram, I've done career quizzes. And people like me, we take them because we want certainty. We want to find some relief in this turmoil inside of us that says we need to figure it all out, and we need to figure it out now. I wanted some clarity, some clues to my identity and my purpose. But I don't think people are really looking for information. I think they're looking for certainty and permission. Permission that, yes, you were created to become this one person. But even though I know they assign us job titles, because that's probably what the people taking the test most want to see, we tend to ignore everything else for the title. For instance, I took a personality test, a career quiz, whatever you want to call it. And it said, 2 of the answers were, I should be a scientist and I should be a funeral director. I'm going to be honest with you. I suck at STEM. I did well in my science classes in school, but it was not anything that I ever could do well enough to make a career out of it. And as for being a funeral director, I would be crying my eyes out alongside the families all day, every day. So that was not a good fit. But I focused on the job title instead of the information, the data that was able to be gleaned from those job titles. So the recommendation wasn't necessarily wrong, but the interpretation was too literal, because people that administer these exams and create these exams know that we're looking for job titles, when in reality we should be looking for data. Because while I would never be a good scientist because I stink at math and other STEM related things, but the qualities that the assessment was probably seeing in me was that I'm comfortable with difficult situations. I'm comfortable helping people through transitions. I love change. I have an innate sense of curiosity about everything. I'll get fascinated with something and I'll spend hours digging into it just because I'm curious and I want to know more. If there's a word I don't know the meaning of, I'll go look it up. And because of that curiosity, I'm also pretty adept at making meaning out of things. So the recommendation is often the least interesting part. Also, I think another difficulty with these types of exams is that it assigns us a static way of being. And I've even taught that to people. I used to teach a course at a local technical school that had adult education classes, and it was called Discovering Your Ideal Work. Did it years ago. But one of the things that I used to say as part of this course was the core of who you are does not change. So that's why I, pitched StrengthsFinder. I talked about Myers-Briggs because those speak to the core of who we are. So when I first took that exam for Myers-Briggs, as I said, I was an INTJ. But also, as I said, I didn't see what the actual scores were. Well, when I take it now, the only thing that stays static is I am no longer an S, a sensor, a detail person. I am an intuitive, that second letter, I'm an N now. And that means that I'm a big picture person, in putting it in short form. The other three categories, depending upon the day or the way the questions are worded, I may score one way or the other. There are some days that I feel very extroverted and other days that I feel very introverted. I'm more of what's called an ambivert because I can switch between the two. And the scores, even if I score a little bit one way or the other, are very balanced. Same with the T and the F, the thinker and the feeler. Some days I'm more of a thinking person. Some days I'm go by your gut. And then there's the J and the P at the end. I'm also very balanced in those. My scores are very close together and right along that line. So I changed. I moved from a details person. When I first took the test, I was very much an administrative assistant. I've been some type of secretary for years and years and years. But at that time, I was very much a detail person because that was what I spent most of my day doing in my work. Now I'm in a leadership position, so most of what I do is seeing the big picture and how to navigate my organization through the big picture. Also, 15 years ago, I took a StrengthsFinder exam. It wasn't long, it hadn't been out very long. I saw a talk by Marcus Buckingham and decided I've got to get in on that. So I went and took a test. 15 years ago, my top 5 StrengthsFinder categories were maximizer, ideation, strategic, achiever, relator. But as an author, there is an individual, Becca Syme, that she does StrengthsFinder and helps writers apply it to their writing life. So I just thought, hey, let's join up for her coaching and see what happens. And one of the things she had me do was retake the StrengthsFinder exam. And my scores were not the same. Very similar, but not the same. So I was maximizer, ideation, strategic, achiever, relator. Now I'm strategic, maximizer, ideation, self-assurance, and arranger. So achiever and relator dropped off the scale and self-assurance and arranger came in. Self-assurance comes with maturity. And at this point in my life, I'm not really concerned about achieving a lot of goals. But 15 years ago, I was in the midst of my career and climbing the corporate ladder and learning how to do things on a higher level. So that changed. So I was wrong. The core of who we are does change. It might not change a lot, but it does change. So was either result wrong? No, I don't think so. As I said, we go through different seasons in our lives, and the things that matter to us, the things that get our focus, change over time. Our priorities change. Our environments change. The person you were at 25 isn't gone. They're just no longer driving the bus. So I know that many of us take these kinds of tests because we like to get the recommendations of what we should do with our lives. But the recommendation, as I said, is the least interesting part. And it's unfortunate that that's the part that we pay the most attention to, the label, because we often get trapped by those labels. For example, if I would have taken to heart my first Myers-Briggs exam, I would have said, I'm an introvert, and never considered that maybe I was somewhere in the middle. I'm a helper. I do like to help, but it's not the core of who I am. I'm creative. Or as I used to think, I'm really not very creative because I always had these detailed things that would come up as part of my personality exams. Funeral director, scientist. It was never artist or singer or anything like that. Designer. I never got those. Another label, I'm analytical. All of these labels that we take to heart, but that's why we're taking the test. So we're looking for those labels. But all it's doing is putting us in a box. How many opportunities have we avoided because they didn't match our labels? Most personality tests don't put you in a box. They're just giving you information. But we do that. We don't see somebody who is able to help people transition through change. We see funeral director. We don't see somebody who has an innate curiosity and likes to discover new information. I saw scientist and thought, well, this is stupid. I could never be a scientist. And really, like Myers-Briggs, a 4-letter code, it was never going to explain an entire life. So if you're somebody who loves taking these assessments, I still love taking them, but I'm viewing them very differently at this phase in my life. But remember, the purpose of assessment should not be tell me who I am. The purpose should be help me notice the patterns. Because if I go back, which I did, because I save all of my personality tests, I started going back and seeing the patterns and the different things. And it didn't matter what archetype I was given, what my numerology number was, what my Enneagram information was, my whatever, what my Myers-Briggs was, what my StrengthsFinder was. There are patterns there. I'm very curious. Well, in StrengthsFinder, ideation is somebody who loves to learn about things and has a million ideas for stuff. That's a pattern. That's not a label. So, how do you go about starting to identify patterns? And if you did the assessment that I gave you last week that started having you dig into your archaeological dig that is your life, you may have started to notice some of those. So what energizes me? When you look at that list of things that I used to love to do, what still energizes you? What drains you? We talked about what about your job do you love? What about your job do you hate? And those are the questions you need to ask. What keeps showing up throughout my life? That's one that was very eye-opening to me when I began to pay attention to that. Because, there are some people who have that one thing and they're deep divers and they focus on one thing and they love it and they could do it forever and ever. But I feel like a lot of us are never satisfied with that one thing because we have lots of different interests. We have lots of different things that keep us coming back. And a lot of times, if you start to look at the patterns, then you begin to see a cycle of you may not always focus on building things, but a desire to build things. You may build for a while and then set it aside and go do something else and then do something else and do something else and then come back to building. And I began to see those kinds of patterns in my life. So what themes exist across the different jobs and roles that you've done, particularly the ones that you liked the most, the ones that energized you, the ones where you could get lost in doing it and wish you could spend all day doing it? So I want you to do an exercise. The last video I gave you a worksheet, so you should be able to write some of this down if you've done that worksheet. If you haven't, go back and see the last video I did, and there's a link to a worksheet in the description that's going to walk you through some of these steps to begin discovering the patterns in your life. So I want you to write down 3 jobs or roles or experiences that you loved. Doesn't necessarily have to be a job. If you were a volunteer coordinator at your church, that's a role. Or an experience that you had. Maybe you hiked the Grand Canyon from rim to rim. And then I want you to write down 3 that you hated. And I want you to take a look at those and see the patterns that exist. Because with every love is a hate, and it's 2 sides of the same coin. It's being able to recognize what about it did you love and what about it did you hate. That's both valuable information. It's not that you want to keep doing the things that you dislike doing, but it is data. And this is a lab. That's why we're doing it this way. It is data. Because I don't want you to get overwhelmed with thinking, well, I need to figure this out right now. We're running experiments. Right now we're gathering data so that we can begin to run experiments in the things that we find in the patterns that interest us, that intrigue us, that draw us in for more. So what patterns exist? Not tasks, patterns. Examples. Maybe you taught a Sunday school class and you love teaching. Maybe you are a problem solver, somebody who your organization is always calling upon to solve problems. I always get contacted for logistics. Anytime I'm involved in a group, I end up being a logistics person because I know I'm somebody who can get things done and find the best path, the least disruptive path to getting them done. Maybe you enjoyed creating, even if it's not in an artsy-fartsy way. Maybe you just like making things. Maybe you like leading. I'm not a natural leader, but I will do it if nobody else will. But some people love it. They like being in charge, not because they want to tell everybody what to do, but because they love it and they enjoy it and they're good at it. And a lot of good leaders like to do it because they enjoy mentoring people to help them be better individuals, not just because they want to get more laurels. Maybe you like learning. You're a perpetual student, curious about things. Maybe you like passing that knowledge on to other people, which goes back to teaching. Maybe you like helping people through change, coaching people, students, athletes, people having a difficult time in their life. Because I truly believe that there isn't one perfect answer. But maybe there are recurring themes. And I hate to guarantee anything, but I think if you really start to look at your life and go through these activities, you'll begin to see those patterns emerge. There may be multiple expressions of who you are. Maybe your purpose isn't a destination. It's not about finding that one thing and then doing that forever and ever. Maybe it's a pattern. We aren't trying to discover a label. We're trying to understand a life. And that is a much bigger proposition and a much more worthwhile one. So I'd love to hear your story. And if you have some experience with assessments, I'd love to hear about those. If you're willing to share in the comments, I'd love to hear what personality or career assessment result has never made sense to you. Funeral director was one for me. You can tell because I keep talking about it, so it's one that's really memorable to me. Have you ever taken the same assessment years apart and gotten a different result like I did? What role or career did an assessment suggest that made you laugh out loud? Scientist? That would be a disaster. Do you think people change? Or do you think different parts of us emerge at different times? What patterns have you followed throughout your life, regardless of your job title? If this video resonated with you, I'd love to hear your story. But if you want to hear more of it, I encourage you to like and subscribe. But I want to hear your story. What keeps showing up in your life? What themes seem to follow you from job to job, relationship to relationship, season to season? Because I have a growing suspicion that understanding those patterns might be far more valuable than finding the perfect label. And if you're in a season of rediscovering yourself, you're in the right place. We're going to figure this out together.